Wrestling has always emphasized spectacle over substance, but in 1998, the gap between those priorities was wide enough for Stone Cold to safely drive any heavy-duty vehicle through. The mayhem-laden WWF snatched the lead in the Monday Night Wars with Steve Austin and All Things Attitude, while WCW maintained a strong position, though its product was noticeably becoming more stale as time went on. And ECW? Well, they were surviving, at least. More than surviving, the pay-per-view market was thriving, with WWF and WCW in particular doing boffo business on that front. But for every heart-stopping King of the Ring, excellent SummerSlam, and killer Heatwave, there was dreck. A whole lot of no-refund, unforgivable dreck. I'm Sam Driver from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are the 10 worst wrestling pay-per-views of 1998. Join us! Number 10, WCW Bash at the Beach. Let it be said that this was the second most bought pay-per-view in WCW history, earning heavy publicity via NBA rivals Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman taking part in the main event. But big business doesn't mean good product, as evidenced by what was the most bought WCW pay-per-view ever. See You in Hell Starrcade 1997. NBA synergy aside, this was a typical WCW pay-per-view of its time. Strong undercard setting the table for a weak final 90 or so minutes. Juventud Guerrera versus Billy Kidman, Raven versus Saturn, Eddie versus Chavo Guerrero, all good to great. Then came the heavy artillery, like Giant versus NFL star Kevin Green, Conan versus Disco Inferno, and a 4-minute world title match pitting new champ Goldberg against Kurt Hennig. Even promising matches like Chris Jericho versus Rey Mysterio and Booker T versus Bret Hart, with Bret competing for the friggin' TV title, were no better than TV decent. And as for Hogan and Rodman versus DDP and Malone, well, it's a 24-minute match during which Rodman fell asleep. Say what you want about David Arquette, but he never dozed off on the job. Number 9, WWF Rock Bottom. Previously in these countdowns, we've noted that WWE generally treated their December offerings as throwaways. Even without that well-evidenced presumption, merely looking at those December pay-per-views and calling them B-shows would be exceedingly flattering. A classic case is 1998's Rock Bottom, a glorified rest stop between the big four priorities. The main event was an overbooked, honestly lousy Buried Alive match between Stone Cold and The Undertaker, notable for Michael Cole insisting that the grave was 6 feet deep, all the while the combatants are standing in it exchanging blows and the ground levels at their torsos. When poor estimation wasn't failing the show, bad wrestling was. The Brood versus the Job Squad, the New Age Outlaws versus Ken Shamrock and Big Boss Man, the Headbangers versus the Human Oddities, and other bouts were just as bad as they were insignificant. Mankind and The Rock's WWF title bout was good, albeit with a needlessly rhymes with flucky finish. Not exactly the ideal stocking stuffer, Rock Bottom. Number 8, WCW Starrcade. Here's one for the philosophers. Is it really an upgrade if Starrcade 1998 is better than its atrocious predecessor, but the show ends with one of the most counterproductive booking decisions in history? Deciding to end Goldberg's celebrated undefeated streak with a thud, or rather a zap, courtesy of Scott Hall, didn't sit well with many fans, and soon it felt like the harbinger to the true beginning of the end for WCW, the subsequent finger poke not helping at all. The Goldberg-Kevin Nash WCW title bout was actually decent enough, a passable bookend. On the other end, Starrcade opened with 2 excellent Billy Kidman Cruiserweight title bouts, but the middle portion, however, was mind-numbingly bad. The biggest show of the year features, let's see, Norman Smiley versus Prince Iakea and Perry Saturn versus Ernest the Cat Miller. Paul, I'll be in WWF Before You Know It White, half-arsed his performance, as did Chris Hey Wait For Me Jericho. Then you had Eric Bischoff pinning Ric Flair, which, I mean, they used to call Starrcade the granddaddy of them all, and sometimes you just gotta put that granddaddy in a home. Number 7, ECW November to Remember. Credit to the fledgling number 3 promotion, they did manage to draw 5,800 fans to a market away from their Philly home. But what those fans on the Bayou got for their dollar was an ECW skidding toward free fall. November to Remember was emblematic of the promotion's ongoing decay. The only worthwhile match was Jerry Lynn versus Lance Storm, and that was admittedly a hair beneath both men's high standards. Tommy Dreamer's mystery partner for a tag match was a demon-addled Jake Roberts, who who wrestled, if that's the word, in street clothes. The main event, pitting the triple threat against Taz, Sabu, and Rob Van Dam, should have been good, but there were an inordinate amount of blown spots, leading to a reported pull-apart backstage afterward among the participants. Nothing else on the show even sniffed the 2-star range, as the 1998 November to Remember was, to invert a Paul Heymanism, a regret you should forget. Number 6. WWF No Way Out. WrestleMania 14 has been lauded as a definitive turning point for the WWF's fortunes. On the whole, the 14th Mania was a landmark occasion where a large pay-per-view audience witnessed the WWF at its metamorphosized attitude best, culminating in Stone Cold's big WWF title win. Just 6 weeks before WrestleMania, however, the WWF trotted out one of the sorriest, most underwhelming secondary cards of the period, and it's amazing that it's adjacent to that Mania. The most criticized part has been the WWF subbing mid-carder Savio Vega in as a surprise replacement for injured champ Shawn Michaels in the 8-man main event. Still a good match otherwise. The rest of the card was an absolute mess, however, the antithesis of a historic Mania. How does the Quebecers versus the Godwins sound? Or Bradshaw versus Jeff Jarrett for an NWA belt? The Headbangers versus a slower Mark Mero and a career Nadir Goldust? Kane versus Get Me Outta Here Vader? The closing 8-man salvages No Way Out from going damn near 0 for 7, but 1 for 7 doesn't exactly put you in the Hall of Fame either. Number 5. ECW Living Dangerously. Only one aspect of Living Dangerously really endured as a worthwhile memory: Bam Bam Bigelow putting Taz through the canvas on a Taz mission reversal spot. The rest of the show was nowhere near as fun or cool, as ECW's many flaws were on full display for the world to see. When you have an injured world champion taking part in a 5-minute tag main event around a hole in the ring, you can kinda make a metaphor out of that. Yep, Shane Douglas and Chris Candido versus Al Snow and Lance Storm was bad, but it wasn't the only bad spot. Masato Tanaka and Doug Furness was a botch-filled disappointment, while Rob Van Dam and Too Cold Scorpio plodded their way through a 22-minute match starkly beneath both men's best work. Tommy Dreamer versus Just Incredible was meant to be the blow-off of a heated feud, but what we got was 9 minutes of extreme basics. Even Taz versus Bigelow before the canvas-breaking bump was on the wrong side of pedestrian. It was less living dangerously and more living lazily. Number 4. WCW World War III. The fourth and final incarnation of World War III came long after the gimmick had any sort of novelty. Fortunately, the 60-man Battle Royal was truncated to a mere 22 minutes, as opposed to loitering around the half-hour mark it had been in years past. That's the nicest thing you can say about this boring slog that set Kevin Nash up to end Goldberg's streak a month later. A Bret Hart DDP US title match followed the Battle Royal and was passable, though the Hitman was clearly phoning it in by this point. Outbound Chris Jericho had a TV title bout with future West Texas redneck Bobby Duncombe Jr. that proved Hart wasn't the only disinterested Canadian functioning on autopilot. Rick Steiner versus Scott Steiner never happened because of a pre-match beatdown, while Stevie Ray versus Conan sadly went on as scheduled. Also, Sonny Ono wrestled. Alas, they didn't book him to win the Battle Royal in an upset. Number 3. WCW Road Wild. Oh god, I've got to do a dissertation on Jay Leno overpowering Hulk Hogan with arm bars. Say what you will about Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman, but at least they're imposing athletes used to getting physical. Leno was a passive talk show host who was only threatening to dogs that whimper at the sounds of high-pitched noises. What's scary is that there were like 3 or 4 matches worse than Leno and DDP versus Hogan and Bischoff, because those matches didn't have DDP to bust his ass in. With all due respect to Steve McMichael, his match with Bryan Adams set new standards for in-ring miscommunication. Public Enemy versus Alex Wright and Disco Inferno was 15 minutes of bad. Stevie Ray versus Chavo Guerrero was bad. Meng versus Barbarian was bad. Please don't hurt me, Meng. And world champion Goldberg was relegated to a bloody battle royal. All of that came before Leno's Squared Circle Soiree, which was just another reason to join Team Coco. Number 2. ECW Wrestlepalooza. So you see, WWE wasn't the first company to use the name Wrestlepalooza. Of all the extreme monikers to unearth, WWE picked one used for what's arguably the worst ECW pay-per-view of all time, if you don't count December to Dismember, of course. With a laundry list of injuries, Shane Douglas defended the ECW title against Al Snow, and it wasn't pretty. Snow was never more over than he was in 1998, but this was just brutal. TV champ RVD and Sabu went to a 30-minute draw filled with rest holds, blown spots, and general lack of prep. Dreamer and Sandman versus the Dudleys was nothing like their one-night stand sprint, while Bigelow versus New Jack was just as clunky. When Credible and Mikey Whipwreck's passable TV bout is match of the night, clearly ECW's found itself in an extreme rut. And number 1, WCW Fall Brawl. We here at Cultaholic once dared Fraser to watch this show for the purposes of doing a video on it, and long story short, his legal action claiming emotional damages is still pending, sorry Fraser. And honestly, you can't blame the lad for feeling fragmented. He had to watch the worst war games ever, a 3-on-3 farce filled with more warrior hokum than any person should ever have to bear witness to. Snore Games was the capper to an all-time bad pay-per-view, one where Davey Boy Smith suffered a life-altering staph infection from landing on Warrior's crappy trapdoor. It was one of those shows where outside of Raven and Saturn, no one seemed to give a fraction of a damn. Conan vs. Scott Hall was a tandem sleepwalk masquerading as an NWO turf war. Rick and Scott Steiner's singles bout was hamstrung by an insulting Buff Bagwell injury fake-out months after he was almost legitimately paralyzed. Chris Jericho worked with a fake Goldberg before learning the real Goldberg, world champ and absent from this show, didn't want to work with him. And then there was War Games, which yeah, Fall Brawl was a historic misfire and easily the worst pay-per-view of 1998.